his family was sick earlier this week. Last night. I'm not that bad. That's belly and really bad. Right? Thank you. So I sent an email about tomorrow. Yeah, so much. But I'm going to move it to 11:30 and over Zoom so that I don't have to. I don't know if Marinder's going to see this live. I saw you leaving with all this equipment yesterday. I was like, oh, you should have brought it over. That was a lot of stuff. You were right.
Yeah, it's a problem. I was like just picking it up.
Yeah, there should be like adjustments. I don't know this one. Like there's an up and down. There you should be able to do it. I just don't know which one it is. Yeah, it's this one here.
Right. Perfect.
So yeah, you can tighten it so that it won't shake.
Great, thank you.
So I'm not going to stay too long. But,
yeah.
Are you going to need help getting that back?
I'll bring it tomorrow.
You sure you're okay getting that home and everything? I was feeling really...
I live right there.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's good. So I was like seeing you going with your big backpack and all that stuff. I was like, oh man, you should have brought it over.
No, it's okay. I don't know.
Okay. Is that working?
Yeah, it only goes a little bit, so.
It should go. Let me try it a little bit.
Oh, maybe I just have to loosen it more.
It could be, or it could be at the end of the rotation.
I just need to loosen it more, I think. Or maybe.
It's not going that way. It's just that little bit. Huh. There's got to be something else there. Maybe this one? No, that's that. Oh.
Maybe it only rotates a little. This is going to be a bad video. Okay.
You want to get the speakers is the most important thing.
Yeah.
You can cut this part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's really weird. I know you can. Is it not this one? Did you try that one?
I did. That goes up and down.
Yeah, this is... Okay, here's Dennis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please take a seat. You know, in the life of a community like a university, there are these rare moments when things come together, things align in terms of our mission, our place in society, how we educate, how we form a community, and how we touch the world. And I am deeply proud to be, and honored to be introducing one of those moments to you. As Vice Provost for Global Engagement, it's an important moment for us as a campus to think about UO for humanity in terms of the recent natural disaster in Turkey and Syria. And it is with deep thanks and appreciation to you for coming, to Harinder Halta for building this event, Undugu Arslan as well, for making this happen, that I think we have an opportunity this afternoon to be at our best as a higher education community, to bring together the science and the soul, the content and the character, the meaning and the music, all as a way of gathering and processing what has happened, how it touches us as individuals, as a place in the world, and as global citizens. So with that, thank you for coming. Thank you to Harinder and Undugu for making this happen. And please let me hand it over to Undugu, the next part of the show.
my country Turkey and northern Syria woke up to a shocking day on February 6 at 4 in the morning. The first day of the earthquake in Turkey went by in chaos due to the lack of communication between the affected cities and the rest of the country. In the following days, the impact of the earthquake was finally evident. So far, there have been 3 earthquakes of massive magnitudes, thousands of aftershocks, almost 50,000 people reported death, and millions of people becoming homeless. These are just numbers, and numbers are cold. What about the humanistic aspect of it? One of the affected cities, Hatay, is my hometown. I lived there for 19 years, and now there is nothing left of it. Survivors in the affected cities are traumatized for life. They are still not able to sleep peacefully to this day. It has been exactly 2 months since the disaster. So, why do we still need to bring it up now? The disaster scale is so massive, and people still need support. We decided to organize this event to make sure it's not forgotten in the news cycle, and to remind everyone that these disasters do not always happen in different countries and to the families of other people. We need to make sure we are knowledgeable about our city's seismic activity and be prepared for a disaster in this way. For making this event possible, I would like to thank you all professors who kindly accepted to give presentations today, the great musicians from diverse backgrounds who will contribute to the event, and the team who have been working hard behind the scenes from day one. And finally, your support as the audience for the cause means a lot to us. Between each presentation, you will see QR codes linked to the reliable organizations you can donate to. One-time or monthly donations are available if you wish to contribute. Now, I leave the floor to my amazing supervisor, Harander Halsa. Thank you so much.
We're extremely grateful that you all gathered today to learn and create a sustainable support system for the people who are affected by the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. I believe natural disasters of this magnitude, many times accompanied by our own neglect, are a call of Mother Nature for us to unite, to take care of the earth and each other with open hearts, informed minds, and willingness to work together fearlessly. I hope tonight will inspire us to take such healing actions continuously in the future without having to be reminded by such natural disasters. Today I thank all of my colleagues from the University of Oregon who are here to educate us by offering their expertise on different aspects of what happened and how we can prepare for such cases, even though we hope and pray that it never happens. We will also hear a presentation about the effect and impact of media in reporting such events, so they don't get forgotten. People from all different faith traditions lived and who are still alive, still live in harmony in many parts of the areas that were affected by the earthquake. So we're very grateful to have today with us a wonderful group of presenters who will share with us sacred songs from their own traditions to honor that unity and to invoke that same in our community. I would also acknowledge that this event wouldn't have happened without the institutional and organizational support from our dear Lori O'Halloran. She's the Assistant Vice Provost for International Affairs and Director of Global Studies Institute at the University of Oregon. Dennis Galvan, he's our Dean and Vice Provost of the Division of Global Engagement, and Anish is the Executive Director of the School of Global Studies and Languages. So thank you for all that support. And I'm also extremely grateful for the leadership that our Turkish Fulbright foreign language teaching assistant Funda Gül has shown. She really mobilized the community to raise awareness and relief funds since day one of the earthquakes. And we're extremely lucky to have people like her work with these young emerging leaders who come to the University of Oregon from all over the world. So I'm grateful that our university can support them and create this opportunity for us to learn from them. There's a deeply rooted optimism in the hearts of Turkish people, to the point that they express in their language by saying, "Her işte bir hayır vardır." There is good in everything. This, however, is a moment where they, along with the people of Syria, let's not forget that they need a lot of support to reclaim that optimism. So our hope is to really create that flow of sustainable aid that can go to them, to all those people who are left homeless, jobless, without proper access to safe water, food, education. So please consider donating monthly to one of the organizations we have identified. Most of them are UN-related organizations, World Kitchen, there's Doctors Without Borders, Turkish Philanthropy Funds, and UNICEF. And if you have others in mind, you can feel free to use them. So this is what we kindly ask you. And I thank you all again for being here, and pass the word to Guy and Diego Menga from Earth Sciences, our colleagues, who will tell us about what happened and what's the geological realities in that. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. So the first bit that we're going to talk to you about today is just giving you some of the geological background of what's going on in this area, to give you a founding of why are there so many earthquakes here, and why did this one happen, and kind of why did it catch us a little unawares. So we're going to be talking about this 2023 Turkey earthquake doublet, the signs and the impacts. And I will be presenting with Dr. Diego Melgar. So I'm Guy. I am a PhD candidate, currently studying volcanology, but my previous academic life was as a cultural anthropologist, and I was trained in Middle Eastern studies. After I decided to go back into geology, I actually worked on the timing of different continental collision events in Western Turkey, so I'm really excited to be able to kind of get that to you guys today. Dr. Melgar is an associate professor of geophysics in our Department of Earth Sciences. He was born in Mexico, so he has also experienced lots of earthquakes and comes at this with a really good grounding from his own experience. And he currently works on large earthquakes, their hazards, and their early warning systems. So he'll be talking to you much more about the seismology, which as a volcanologist I can't really go into in too much detail. So today we're going to really be discussing where the earthquakes happened, the geography of the region, so if you're not familiar with Turkey and Syria, you kind of know where things are, the earthquake history in this area, and then the science of the earthquakes, from the surface expression of the rupture process, and ground motions and shaking, and what that actually means for things like building codes. What I have in this image is Gaziantep Castle. It is an old Crusader castle that unfortunately was destroyed in this 2023 earthquake. The top images, the before image and the bottom image is the rubble that remains. So just to give you guys a little bit of grounding on where we are, what we're talking about. Turkey is located across two continents, Europe and Asia. It's located on something called the Anatolian Peninsula. So today I'm going to be kind of using Turkey and Anatolia interchangeably, so you know what I mean. Syria is in Western Asia and is solidly located in what we call the Middle East. I've marked Istanbul and Damascus because those are two cities I'm assuming all of you know that I'm talking about. But the earthquake itself happened at this location, Kahramanmaraş, in south-central Turkey. And the area that we're going to be discussing, that we're going to be looking at, is actually home to over 7 million people, so has affected a very, very large population. And so it didn't only affect that single region, though. What I have here is a shake map. Diego is going to discuss more what this means, but it just kind of shows you where things were felt. And even though its largest significant ramifications are for the area immediately surrounding Kahramanmaraş, it was felt as widely as Egypt, Greece, and Armenia. So something that has a much larger regional feeling. So what I'm going to set up for you today is why is this region so earthquake prone? And this is actually a process millions of years in the making. So 200 million years ago, Turkey didn't exist in the form that we know it today. This video that's showing, you can see this is modern Turkey, and it doesn't look anything like the Anatolian continent. So over this 200 million year process, you have lots of little microcontinents that have been stacked up against each other, collided to form what we know as the modern Anatolian microplates. And this process is something we call accretion, and the stacking of lots of microcontinents creates what we call an accreted terrain. And these accreted terrains that you saw in the video are shown in more detail here on this kind of simplified geologic map. So you have this Anatolite Taurite block was once its own little microcontinent that collided with this Persian block. And so you have all of these different stacked terrains on top of each other, kind of squished, scraped off on one another. And where all of those areas are where those terrains met, you actually have what are called suture zones. And suture zones are really important for understanding modern Turkish geology because these zones are actually zones of weakness. This is where stresses, like compression and extension, are actually taken up and felt. And it's along these suture zones that you have larger fault systems form. So in Turkey, there are two main fault systems that we usually think about. One is this North Anatolian Fault in the north. It runs through the Marmara Sea, crosses really close to Istanbul, and all across the Black Sea region of Turkey, kind of ending as you get towards Georgia and Armenia. Then you have the East Anatolian Fault, which is in south-central Turkey, cuts right across this Kahramanmaraş area, and meets up with the North Anatolian Fault. So most of the earthquakes that you see actually occur along these. Now modern seismicity, there's lots of those little accreted terrains, those microcontinental blocks. But today, the seismicity is really driven by this combination of different plate movements from the African plate, the Eurasian plate, and the Eurasian plate, and how they interact with the Anatolian block. So you have the African plate, which is moving north relative to the Anatolian block. You actually have the Hellenic Arc right here, and the Cyprus Arc. This is a subduction zone like we have off of the Cascadia coast. And you have lots of volcanoes there, which we won't discuss today, but this is a big portion of what's happening in Kahramanmaraş as well. And then as you move towards eastern Turkey, you have the Arabian plate, which is also moving north relative to the Anatolian block. Now, movement along this area, we don't have a subduction zone, we have the side-to-side motion that we call a transform motion or transform fault. So it's just two plates sliding against each other. It's very similar to what you see with the San Andreas Fault in California. Now to complicate this even more, you have the Eurasian plate, which is moving kind of southeast relative to the Anatolian block. Again, this is putting lots of compression on Anatolia. And again, like the East Anatolian Fault, that motion is kind of dominated by transform side-to-side motion. And then there's the Anatolian block in the middle of it all, being compressed by all sides, and it's being pushed out west. So it's literally being squeezed towards the west. This is something that we refer to as toothpaste tectonics, because it's like squeezing out the toothpaste tube. And this is also similar to something that's happening in the Himalayas today. Now, if we zoom in a little bit more, we're looking specifically then at this East Anatolian Fault. And it's a very complicated region around Kahramanmaraş. And this is partly because you have a place where the African, Arabian, and Anatolian plates are meeting in something called the Hatay Triple Junction. So we have that Cyprus subduction here, East Anatolian fault here with the side-to-side motion, and then there's, to add even more complication to this, the Dead Sea fault from the south that is also that transform motion. And this triple junction has migrated over time. And while in these images, it may look like this is a really nice, easily defined fault system, but that's not how geology works in the real world. These faults are actually accommodated by multiple fault segments, which kind of adds to the complication of understanding what's going to happen in this region. What are the risks associated with this? How is the fault going to rupture? Now, I've given you kind of that background. This here is a map of Turkey's earthquake hazards. And it's been known for a long time that earthquakes are a very dangerous thing that can happen in this region. Just from this earthquake hazard map, you can easily trace out the North Anatolian faults, the East Anatolian fault. We won't get into what's happening in West Anatolia because it's messy. But you have these areas, especially around the area that was impacted in 2023 earthquakes this year, that has a very high hazard risk associated with it, with these possible earthquakes. So what I'm about to show you is just earthquakes that have occurred in Turkey since 1900. And since 1900, there have been 21 magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquakes. So as you go through, you can see, you'll be able to see that a lot of earthquakes happen along the North Anatolian fault. In 1939, you had a magnitude 7.8 fault rupture in Erzincan, resulting in very large loss of life. And then in 1999, you had another large rupture of the Izmit earthquake, magnitude 7.6. And then finally, you have this very large rupture, magnitude 7.8 and 7.6 in the Kahramanmaraş sequence. And what's really important to note is the 1999 earthquake was large, had a very large loss of life. Turkey vowed to change its building codes, vowed never again, and here we are 24 years later. And while it's weird that it took place in this specific area, unfortunately we're having to talk to you today about this. So I'm going to pass this off to Dr. Melgar to really get you into the seismology and the exact sequence of the earthquakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy, and good afternoon, everybody. So, Guy did a fantastic job of hopefully communicating to you that this place is messy and complicated. Let's talk about these two earthquakes in particular. Most of you will know that what happened was two very large earthquakes, magnitude 7.8 and 7.6. We'll talk a little bit more about what those numbers mean in a second. They struck in quick succession, which is what made it particularly interesting. The first one happens, it's devastating. And then 9 hours later, the scientist in you might ask, why 9 hours? Why not 8? Why not 1? Why not 3 weeks? But 9 hours later, the 7.6 earthquake strikes, and it has massive ground motions, shaking, that affect a population that is already very vulnerable from the first event. So tens of thousands, actually depends on how you count, but almost you could even think hundreds of thousands of aftershocks follow, continue today. And what you see here in this little inset and in the map are all the aftershocks. These are all earthquakes that have occurred since February 6th. And you can see their magnitude here and how they're decaying with time. Not all of these are felt. Many of them are too small to be felt. But you can imagine, but many of them are felt. So you can imagine what it's like to be outside in the snow, because this happened during winter, and to be feeling constant rumbling and always wondering what's going to happen next. This is a very common occurrence with these large crustal events. This is not peculiar behavior. Up to now, we know that there's about 50,000 casualties that have been reported in Turkey and about 10,000 in Syria. Those numbers will indubitably grow. And at least 10,000 collapsed structures just in Turkey alone. So one of the things that is scientifically, geologically, extremely remarkable about this event is that the fault reaches the surface and we can literally go and touch it for hundreds of kilometers, for hundreds of miles. So these are pictures of the fault trace, we would say, or the surface rupture. And it can be traced almost for its entirety. It's not always common that an earthquake ruptures the surface. There's many earthquakes that are buried ruptures, we would say. We know they're there, but they don't leave behind surface expression. In some places, if you look at this is the midline of the road. The other midline of the road is over here. You can see that this block moved to the right, this block moved to the left by about the width of a lane, which is, I don't know, 10 feet. So imagine hundreds of miles of crust displacing by that amount. So that's very remarkable, and geologists are having a lot of work to do in the field to map it and measure what was the displacement. That's the first order thing we care about. We want to know, was it 1 meter, 3 meters, 10 meters? That gives us important geologic clues about the processes going on there. What's also remarkable is that this surface rupture is so obvious and easy to see that it can quite literally be seen from space. So using radar and optical instruments, we've been able, or science, not me, but others, have been able to trace the entirety of the surface rupture from southwestern Turkey all the way through to the north. Now, what I want you to take away from this is that here's a scale bar, 20 miles, and I'll measure this for you in the next slide. It's gigantic, truly gigantic. But what I want you to take away from this is maybe leave this room with a preconception being shattered that earthquakes are not points, right? When you hear about an earthquake in the news, there's always a little circle that tells you where the earthquake is. Earthquakes are not points. Maybe tiny earthquakes, you can consider them points, though they're not really. They might be about the size of a coin, for example. But once earthquakes get big enough, they span entire regions. So take that away. They have finite extent, and what's really remarkable about this earthquake is that you can see this fault is what he described to you as the East Anatolian fault. But look at this little sliver that's involved, this little sliver that's involved, this little sliver that's involved. It's really like a fracture zone. It's a fault network. It isn't really one single fault. And that's interesting. We care about that, and we want to know why and what processes are going on there. So, to drive the point home a little bit, this is the fault trace or surface rupture that we know was responsible for the first event, the magnitude 7.8. And this little chunk up here is responsible for the second event, the magnitude 7.6. And to put that in round numbers, that means that the first event was about 210 miles long, and the second event was about 100 miles long. So between the two of them, well over 300 miles of ruptured crust, which is what makes them so destructive. Now, maybe you look at this map of Turkey and it's not immediately obvious to you what that means or what that implies. So I did a rough thing and I traced the line through this one, the 7.8, and I traced the line through this one, the 7.6. And I put it here on this map for you to maybe bring the message home a little bit more. I wasn't very scientific about this. I didn't make sure that it was correct to the kilometer, but I'm pretty sure that this is pretty accurate. Here's the size of fault that ruptures in the 7.8. Again, here's the size of the 7.6. It's roughly a rupture from Corvallis to Seattle, which is a long, long distance. You just drove down from there. It's a long distance, right? Imagine how long it would take you to drive across that surface rupture. 5 hours plus. And then you have the 7.6, which spans a good chunk of the width of the state of Washington. So these things are really, really big. Now imagine if this had happened in Southern California, it would span from the US-Mexico border across LA and the Inland Empire. 30, 40, 50 million people live there. And go all the way to Bakersfield. Or if you want to do it in the North Bay, from Sacramento, well down into almost the southern tip of the Central Valley. So these events are huge, and actually an event of this size is what happened in 1906. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake ruptured from about here to about here. So these things are pretty significant. Now, I'm going to show you, this is my research specifically, just in this one slide. I want to talk to you about this because it's such an interesting event. So we're looking here at a 3D perspective view of this fault network that I just described. Here it is again in map view. So what we can do in the lab, using computers and observations of seismometers and all these radar observations and satellite observations I just described, is we can ask, well, what kinds of motions at the fault are necessary to reproduce what we see in the instruments. So here you see the 3D perspective view of this fault network, and I'll just let this play as I talk about it. The earthquake is born there in this fault, reaches this intersection before spreading side to side bilaterally. There's a 9-hour delay, and then the second earthquake ruptures. Now, this is pretty complicated, and this is the final distribution of motion on the fault. I'll let that move. Now, scientifically, what's interesting to us about these, what do we look for? Why do we care about this? Well, first of all, that it ruptures in this complicated three-dimensional mesh of faults is already pretty remarkable, difficult to model, and interesting to us. The second thing I want you to notice these numbers, 3.2 kilometers per second, that's the speed at which the rupture is happening. Now that feels fast, it is pretty fast. I converted it to kilometers an hour, and it's something like 11,000 kilometers an hour, which seems like ridiculously fast, but it's a pretty normal number for how ruptures propagate inside the Earth. But what's really interesting is the second event that happens 9 hours later. You'll see it's much faster. The number will pop up here. I think it's 4.8 kilometers per second right there. It breaks really fast. And that actually is faster than the speed of sound in rocks. And the reason we care about that is because the speed of sound in rocks is about 3.4 or 3.6, and that's normal. That behavior is normal. When a rupture breaks faster than the speed of sound, you can think of it as a supersonic rupture. We call that a super shear rupture. That's fairly rare. We've seen that before in other earthquakes in Alaska, shaking more intense. So these are the kinds of clues we try to tease out to maybe understand why shaking was as intense as it was. And finally, what I want you to take away from this is that not only are earthquakes not points, we've already addressed that, but they take some amount of time to rupture. The first one is here in red. It takes about 60 seconds. It takes about a minute for the rupture to go from start to finish. For the second earthquake, it takes about 30 seconds for the rupture to go from start to finish. So imagine if you translate that to shaking, if you're standing around here, you might feel shaking for a minute or longer. Sit in silence for a minute and see how long that feels like. So, what does this all mean for shaking? I'm going to show you a bunch of maps, so I want to orient you before I confuse you with the maps. These shake maps that he alluded to are in this color scale that in seismology we call the intensity. The magnitude is a number that tells you the size, the physical size of the earthquake, but it doesn't tell you whether you felt the shaking strongly or weakly. It's intensity that tells you whether you felt a big shock or just a gentle roll. We have this numerical scale that goes from 1 to 10. It used to be very qualitative, moderate, strong, very strong, and so on. Now it's a little bit more quantitative, and it relates to this number that has to do with the acceleration due to gravity. I won't belabor the point, but anything above 6, you'd be really scared if you felt it, okay? And once it gets to 8, you'd be terrified if you were feeling that. So just keep that sort of 5 to 6 threshold as the point at which that shaking would really, really worry you. And usually after 6, if you're a building, you start to fear for yourself and your ability to hold yourself upright. So here's what those two earthquakes look like. Again, this green to yellow is where we start to get really concerned, especially when the building code is not up to snuff. Here is the shake map for that first event and the shake map for that second event. Because earthquakes are not points, close to the fault, the shaking is more intense. And as you go away from the fault, the shaking lessens. But you still get perceived shaking, as Guy said, as far away as Egypt, for example. It might feel like a truck went by, not anything to worry about, but you will probably have noticed that something had happened. So this shaking is pretty intense. It gets well into the red, which is 8, intensity 9, for example. This is a map of building collapses. Red are collapses, buildings that have been identified as collapsed. 10,000, this number is out of date now, this is about a month old. 10,000 collapsed buildings on this map. 5,000 buildings on top of these 10,000 needing to be demolished, 42,000 with heavy damage, 140,000 buildings with slight damage. So significant impact. Now, as a seismologist, you see this level of damage, and you can't help but wonder that while it's to be expected that when an earthquake is large, there will be significant damages, that's a lot of damage. So as a scientist, the first thing you ask is, well, was the shaking from this earthquake anomalously high? Would that explain why 10,000 collapsed buildings? So I'll walk you through this very technical plot. Shown here in the dots are stations, seismic stations that measure shaking. So the y-axis is just intensity of shaking. Less shaking if you're lower, lots of shaking if you're higher, and they're ordered by distance to the earthquake. On the left-hand side, you're close to the earthquake. On the right-hand side, you're far away from the earthquake. The details of the numbers and the units are unimportant. What's important is that we've been doing seismology for a while, for a long time. And so we know what we expect from earthquakes of certain sizes. And that's this purple line. And the purple shaded region is, given the magnitude of the earthquake, we know that almost every earthquake will have shaking somewhere inside this purple shaded region. And so I look at this as a seismologist and I say, you know what? Outside of a few points where yes, there's very anomalous strong shaking, by and large, the shaking from this earthquake is not that remarkable. It's strong, yes, but it's not outside of what we would have expected from previous knowledge of past events. So, what happened? So this is when we talk about this very old adage in seismology, which is that earthquakes don't kill people, it's buildings that kill people. So when we are asked as seismologists, what is the thing I can do to protect myself the most, or I'm really afraid for earthquakes and my safety, well, the first line of defense is always the building code. Build buildings that don't collapse during earthquakes. That's the very first thing we need to do as a society. And so something happened in Turkey that scenes like this were far, far too common. There's places where that can maybe be perhaps excused. This is, I'll walk you through this. This is Hatay, here at the southern edge of the rupture, right on top of the earthquake. Okay, this city is right on the fault. This is a plot of the black line, either the black or the dashed line. Again, it's intensity of shaking. The black line are what the engineers were told they needed to design for. This is called the design spectrum. They were told, you need to build buildings that are capable of withstanding something up to this black line, okay? The blue and the red and the green are different seismograms of what actually happened. They're above the black line. That's bad. That means that the ground motions were higher than what buildings were designed for. So in that case, it's maybe not surprising that there were building collapses. However, there's other places. This is Adana on the far western side of the rupture. Once again, these black lines are what engineers were told they needed to design for. And you see that the seismograms are really far below that, which means that the ground shaking did not exceed what the buildings are supposed to withstand. And yet, over here, there were many collapses as well. Maybe not nearly as many as in Hatay, but still many collapses. So something went wrong there. And that's what is going to have to be figured out, and that is beyond seismology, and it has more to do with humans, systems of government, norms, and how we decide to do or not do as a society. So what I tell people is that this might feel like it's happening in some corner of the world far removed from us. It's not. This is what it might look like in Southern California after a magnitude 7.8. We don't necessarily have the same risks in Southern California with buildings. This is something called non-ductile concrete. But we have other sorts of problems in Southern California that are equally dangerous. So seismologists like Lucy Jones, who spent a year in residence here some time ago, have been saying to take this as fodder to take meaningful action. Likewise, in the Pacific Northwest, it's even worse. I can't walk around Eugene without being terrified of what we call soft stories, nary a shear wall in sight in many of these places, which is something that engineers like to add to soft stories. Unreinforced masonry. I'm not going to bore you with those details. It's scary once you learn about buildings and their their ability to withstand earthquakes to walk around the Pacific Northwest. And that's a regional problem. It's in Oregon and it's in Washington. And people like Harold Tobin, who's in the audience here today from the University of Washington, have also been penning articles saying, hey, this could happen here too, and what we've done is not nearly enough. So later on, my colleague Valerie will tell you a lot more about the Pacific Northwest, and I'll leave that here for now. Thank you. Do you want to change, and we'll do questions after?
Our presenters have agreed to stay a few more minutes after we're done with all the presentations, so we'll save question answer time to that, if that's okay with everyone. So we can start.
After all that, I feel like I could lead a breathing exercise. Everyone's as overwhelmed as I am. Before I start my short presentation, I will say if you want to learn more about the Oregon Interfaith Hub, I'm on the board of Jonathan right here. Please feel free to talk to us later. So, you know, I've never been to this area of Europe and Asia, but I can imagine some of the people there praying in mosques and other places 5 times a day, as most of you know. And so I thought I would read a very short poem from that part of the world and then offer a prayer in Arabic. I don't speak Arabic, but I've been praying in Arabic in many different languages for over 30 years. And so it's part of my life, that's what I do. And I was requested to read a poem by the Sufi poet Rumi, who's associated with Turkey. He actually was born and grew up in what's now Afghanistan. And these are translations, of course, but this one speaks to me of how we live in our little corner of the world right here, but can we see the similarities? Can we see how we're connected to all people of whatever faith or people of no faith? And so this is called One Song, and then I'll just go right into a prayer, which will just be a short prayer, which I'll sing from the Quran, which I picked because it's healing. You know, when I see this, my mind and my spirit goes to, there's so much healing that needs in the family, just the families alone, and in the earth alone, and all this activity that we just learned about. And then I'll offer a little bit of silence, you know, because in our lives, I don't know about anyone else, but I find time for silence almost every day, but it's almost a radical act, I think. Put away your phone for 10 minutes, or whatever it is, whatever our distractions are. What is praised is one, so the praise is one too. Many jugs being poured into a huge basin. All religions, all this singing, one song. The differences are just illusions and vanity. Sunlight looks slightly different on this wall than it does on that wall, and a lot different on this other one. But it is still one light. We have borrowed these clothes, these time and space personalities from the light, and when we praise, we pour them back in. I forgot to say, I'll read a little bit again, because when you hear a poem, I know there's people who could care less about poetry here, but when you hear a poem, you're just hearing a little bit, and then if you hear a little bit again, maybe you hear something without listening, if that makes any sense. Sunlight looks slightly different on this wall than it does on that wall, and a lot different on this other one, but it is still one light. Allahumma salli ala shafi'a fi jami'il alamin. 'Allahumma 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 salli ala shafi'a fi jami'il alamin.
everyone. Thank you for the invitation to this panel. I hope this is going to work out fine. I have some media to share with you. And I just want to warn you that I'm going to be opening up with two video clips. One is from the American Natural History Museum. The other one is from news from Turkey a few days after the earthquake. And some images there may be disturbing for some, so I just want to give you a warning. And then I will unpack and talk about media, the role of media, and how we as a community could engage with media to promote more education about this, about the impact of natural disasters. And I want to just say a disclaimer, it's not my expertise, media in natural disasters, but I do a lot of work with media and war and violence. And I noticed that there is a correlation, and actually I'll show some numbers from the Brookings Institute for internal displacement. And actually there is a lot of correlation in displacement of violence and also natural disasters. And many times both are combined in parts of the world. So, and then I'll be unpacking that and see how we can team up with the media as a community and seek for more educational stuff. And actually, as our colleagues were talking, I was thinking the University of Oregon should be putting all of that in video and creating like mini or micro documentaries to educate our population about what's taking place, not only in other parts of the world, but how can we prevent these events here. We won't prevent natural disasters, but we can prevent the disaster that comes with that. So let's see, we go there.
Natural disasters are a part of the way the planet works. In the ideal world, we would all live in places that aren't affected by natural hazards. We wouldn't live near coastlines, wouldn't live along the San Andreas Fault in California, we wouldn't live underneath the volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest. But we live where our homes are. I mean, those are the places that are important to us. And then there are many people that don't have choices. The museum is presenting this exhibit to describe these events to people so they have a better understanding of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, and tornadoes. But more than that, to begin thinking about the risks associated with it. As climate warms, we expect there to be more severe storms, more severe droughts, more wildfires, and to some extent, over the last decade, we've seen just that. There's no way we're going to avoid the natural hazards on the dynamic Earth. But there are certainly ways that we can learn to live with them to mitigate the risks to society.
So that's one way that we could help our communities by creating this type of media. The next one that I'm going to share is part of Al Jazeera. And this was, it's a typical journalistic report of an event where a disaster has taken place. And I want you to think there how the media operates, especially international media that has these cycles of 24/7. There is a lot of repetition of the news and what are the things that they focus on, not only to praise politicians for action, and to also inform the community, the local community, but the international community. So what are the type of framings they are using and how they appeal to our emotions as well?
كنت لقيت قصة تعليقات قلت لي يا عم مشان الله بدكم سلاسة وأنا هون يعني لا تتركوني خلوني يعني اختاروني.
You don't know what was you doing.
Across the border in southern Turkey, missing survivors are still being found alive and pulled from the ruins. Here in northwest Syria, the search and rescue effort was called off on day 5 because rescuers didn't have the resources they say could have saved many lives.
كل ساعة يشكر مرة وصارت تفيقوا وسليمان يا وسليمان أو سليمان موقفين.
هذا عندي أهم شيء في الدنيا كلها. هذا الذكر الله.
Stop there and move now. I hope that you can see there some of what has been already exposed here, how the rubble of the buildings. And as I was doing some research in preparation for this, there are a lot of articles that you can Google on what Erdogan did with the press, because actually, as the aftermath and the days were going by, the press started asking why the building codes were not the way they're supposed to be, when they have been talking about that for 10 years, 2 decades before this. And so the press began to be repressed, and actually some journalists, international journalists were kicked out of the country. So it's important to pay attention to also the tensions between the press and the governments or the politicians in particular instances. So as we want to cover things and keep informing, it becomes very difficult. So what I have here are some numbers just for to start thinking about the tragedy of the combination of violence and also natural disasters. And if you look at the numbers there, this is from 2021, it's natural disasters create more victims than all the violence combined that we see across the world. And it's by the millions, and this is obviously all data. So if we add to this what happened in Turkey and in many other places from 2021 through the pandemic to the earthquake, we have to add a few more millions there. And the number of displaced people, so the pressure that this is creating, and how we as communities and also as journalists have to be thinking on not only the social pressure, but the political pressure that this is creating with people, masses of people in movement across the planet. Right? So now you have that in geographical mode, the amount of people moving across the world because of violence, but more than anything because of climate change. So climate change and other types of natural disasters are becoming worse than internal violence in the movements of people. Right? So this all of this is accessible. If you there are beautiful reports actually that if people are interested, you can go through them, and really it's mind-boggling, right? And why aren't we capable as a humanity to grapple with all of this and prevent? It's really mind-boggling for me. But some things that I want to say about media coverage is that obviously we know that disasters are chaotic, confusing, they create, we react in different forms, but it can be very confusing. What we know in terms of the press is that usually the press has the tendency to use sensational images, right? Because we need to call attention over particular things. So that's what we call the framing. How are we framing people? How are we framing the disasters, right? And then this repetitive use of emotion. And also within the commercial media, the repetition of the cycle, right? Because what you see at 8 a.m., you can see it at noon, you can see it in the evening news and all of that. And also, what I want to call attention here is that after the event, we move into investigation. And that's when typically the press gets in trouble with politicians and with particular governments. Because it's really hard to respond to why we see what we have seen, let's say, in Turkey, in terms of the massive amount of deaths, the toll deaths. So these are some things that I get out of the Earth Journalism Network. Two important main phases that we go through is the initial breaking news period and then the long-term aftermath. So I'm sure that journalists are going to be looking into the Turkey-Syria event all the way until next year, maybe 2 years from now. How are we going to reveal that part of the country? I mean, that will require actually an oversight from the media as well over time. And something that I want to call attention here is this concept of crisis and emergency risk communication, that it's typically used for NGOs, but actually I've been thinking about this and preparing this talk and thinking, how can we make use of that as a university and also as a community here in Eugene? And one thing that is really crucial for the media is that the media has to be engaged with the community, and the community has to be engaged with the media when these events are taking place. But we shouldn't wait until that happens, right? So we have to be very proactive, and we have to create the conditions to know who are the reporters in town, who are the journalists, or who are the people who are super savvy with social media, that we can create networks of communication. Like the UO has, for instance, the UO alerts, right? So how can we use that not only for our community, but for the larger community, thinking of what could take place here? Who are our connecting media in Eugene in terms of the mass media? You know, who has connections with KVAL? Well, the SOGC has, but who else, right, from campus? How are we going to point out at people to follow, you know, this is a trusted network, or this is going to be, you know, trusted information and not fake news, or not news that are so sensationalistic that create fear, and people are going to be turned off by it, right? So here are some principles that we look with CERT. And in terms of media and also for other organizations, is being the first, being right, which means being accurate, be credible, you know, don't make up things, don't exaggerate. Sometimes we won't know enough about the science, so don't make up things, like go to the experts and talk to them, or have them talk to the community, and promote action. And anything you do, whether you are from the press or not, even if you're going to be tweeting with your personal Twitter account, be respectful, right? Because at these moments, it's social vulnerability, especially of poor people, or people who have not the same means that many of us probably in this room have. They need to be treated with a lot of respect. And some tips that all journalists should know, this comes from the Poynter Institute, you know, we have to be more tolerant to uncertainty inherent to any disaster. We have to find out who is really in charge, not just going up to the first person that appears in the picture, but who is really in charge and is going to give us accurate information. dig for deeper context to the story. Don't be shallow, don't just be sensationalistic with images. Look for takeaways. How are we going to educate people? Because there is always an aftermath, there is always the next day. So we need to start educating people at that moment. And just to finish, I want to show you some data for social media that has been used in disasters. And you can see there how much is being used to fundraise or to communicate to the public. And the most, here you can see, that Facebook remains up until 2021, like the most trusted place or the place where people share the most. Right? Like NGOs, in different institutions, even universities are making use of these social media. And these platforms are going to be very useful in the future for all of us if anything were to happen here in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm just going to leave it with this. Media may influence public opinion, actions from politicians in humanitarian aid. Media can educate on many subjects, but media can't work alone, as it needs to engage the communities for successful coverage. So we as media makers need you as much as you need us. So I think that it's important to create that partnership very early on. So thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Galen. This is Thea. I'm come to share 2 songs with you today. These are Lakota Sundance songs. The first song invites the universe to come look at us. It says, here we are standing with strength on Mother Earth. We're sending our voices out for peace. The second song is often used as a memorial song. It talks to our grandparents. It says, we remember you. And we remember the way that we used to be, and that's why we're here today doing the things that we're doing.
Ay, ay, So my name is Valerie Sahakian. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences. And thank you so much to everybody who's put your energy and time into organizing this today. I am a seismologist here. I study the shaking that we expect from earthquakes. And so I'm going to talk about earthquakes here where we live in the Pacific Northwest and what we can likely expect for impacts from them. Oftentimes you hear that Southern California or California is earthquake country, but the Pacific Northwest is as well. And it's a little uncommon here in the sense that we don't feel small earthquakes every day like we do there. But it is earthquake country, and this was brought to the forefront of most of our attention after this 2015 article that came out of the New Yorker called The Really Big One by Catherine Schultz. There are a lot of kind of scary quotes in there, like the earthquake that will destroy Seattle. And the reason that it is earthquake country and that what this article is trying to bring attention to is the fact that we are at a boundary between two tectonic plates. So in Cascadia here, from Mendocino in Northern California all the way up through Canada is a subduction zone. There's an oceanic plate. You can see my mouse. There's an oceanic tectonic plate that's a little bit denser than the continent that we're sitting on. And so when they interact, the oceanic plate sort of sinks and dives beneath it. And when this happens, this builds up forces and stress. As you can imagine, there's friction between the rock and the material in between these two plates. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the earthquakes that we see here, and there are actually different kinds of earthquakes that we see here. I'm going to talk about the difference between seismic hazard and seismic risk, which will tie in a little bit to what has already been discussed about the recent earthquakes in Turkey, and then also talk about what we can do about this risk. So as I mentioned, the reason that we have earthquakes here is that it's a tectonic plate boundary, much like Turkey, but it's a different one in that it's a subduction zone. And so in a system like this, you get forces and stress in three main places in the area. You'll get them in between the two plates, which is an obvious one. So this is called the interface or the megathrust fault. So as the oceanic plate subducts or sinks, it's going to build up stress between itself and the overriding continental plate. You will also get forces and stress, though, in the overriding continental plate itself. So that's because as the oceanic plate is subducting, it's still kind of adding forces to the material that's on top of it. And so this will create faults that make crustal earthquakes, much like the ones we saw in Turkey. The third place that we'll get earthquakes here is within the subducting plate. So similar to the continental plate, as the oceanic plate is subducting, there are going to be forces on that itself as it's being bent. And that will make deep or in-slab earthquakes. And once the forces that are occurring between these plates exceed the strength of the rock around it, that's when an earthquake happens. So the ground will move very suddenly and releases a lot of energy, most of it in the form of shaking during an earthquake. And when we think about the size of an earthquake, the magnitude scale that you've been hearing about, 1 through 9, that's a number scale that we sort of use to communicate in general what's the size of the event. But as seismologists, and in a quantitative sense, we really care about the energy that's released from the earthquake. So for example, a magnitude 7 earthquake actually has 32 times as much energy as a magnitude 6. So that scales as you go upwards. And the energy that is released during an earthquake is related to the area of the fault that breaks. So for example, in a subduction zone, if you imagine an earthquake happening on the megathrust itself, so between the subducting plate and the overriding one, that's this whole area of the sort of blue surface here that would be breaking. We care about how much it breaks or the displacement. So like the image you saw with the offset road, that was about 10 feet, 2 to 3 meters. That is the displacement. And then it also, the rigidity or how strong and rigid the material is matters. So the more area that breaks, the larger the earthquake, and the more it moves, the larger the earthquake. So all of these things matter when we think about the size of earthquakes. And then that brings us back to the size of, or the types of earthquakes that we can expect here. So I just mentioned to you the big megathrust subduction earthquakes that you have between the two plates. But we can also get more than just those types. So we get those subduction zone earthquakes, and those are the really large ones, the magnitude 9s that you can expect. And the reason is because of the sheer area of the fault that breaks. So, we think about it as potentially breaking all the way from Canada to Northern California, so that's 1,000 kilometers long of a fault that breaks, going down 40 kilometers. But you can also get these crustal earthquakes, so the ones in the overriding continental plate, like the Turkey earthquake, and these can be really concerning because the fault that is breaking itself goes up to the surface. So you can actually break the surface of the earth with these faults. And then the third kind are these deep or in-slab earthquakes that happen in the subducting or sinking oceanic plate. And we've had some of these in our lifetimes. So in 2001, there was a magnitude 6.8 earthquake that happened in the subducting oceanic plate. It was called the Nisqually earthquake. It happened right underneath Seattle. Not right, it was about 40 kilometers underneath Seattle in this plate. And when that happened, that caused a lot of damage. So about 400 injuries, about $2 billion in economic losses, and you can see some images from engineering reports and media from that event. And when we look at the shaking from that earthquake, this is a plot very similar to what Diego was showing you, where you can see the yellow is the intensity, so 6, the yellow is kind of where you start to be concerned and start to see damage. And if I put it side by side to the shake map that he showed from the first of the most recent earthquakes, which was the magnitude 7.8 in Turkey, you can see that their shaking is similar to a lot of areas, but it didn't experience the peak intensity, those really red and orange colors, or very strong intensity of this first of this doublet. So this was a crustal earthquake which broke the fault at the surface, and this one happened about 40 kilometers beneath our feet. So that's one thing that matters, is how far away it is. The other thing is the size of it. So this one is a 7.8, this one's a 6.8, which means that this has 32 times as much energy as this one. So that also comes into play. But in addition to having in-slab earthquakes here, we can have crustal faults. And so this was the article, a screenshot of the article that Diego was showing that Harold Tobin, who's here, contributed to, that's talking about what about an example of this in Seattle. So we do have forces in the continental plate, we do have crustal faults here that can create that kind of earthquake. And we think that they're potentially capable of making up to a magnitude 7 earthquake. And so these lines here are showing you where those faults we think intersect with the surface of the earth. And so if those were to break, that would be creating shaking in those areas. And so the thing that's concerning about these is that they're closer to our feet than that 2001 Nisqually earthquake was. So that means that there could be stronger shaking from that. And so then the question is, how do we prevent this? And before I move into talking about how we prevent this, I want to talk about the difference between seismic hazard and seismic risk. When I talk about this, I oftentimes show 2 tables and put them on a map. So the top 10 most damaging or deadliest earthquakes since 1900, which very sadly needs to be updated. And then I also show the top 10 largest ones. So something to note here is the size of the earthquake. So on this table, there's a magnitude 9 earthquake in here, but a lot of them are in the magnitude 7, maybe magnitude 8 range. When you look at the largest earthquakes, these are all above a magnitude 8.5, and half of them are a magnitude 9 or larger. And so why is there a difference between these two? Why is it that you don't see the most effects and damage with the largest earthquakes? And the reason is because of where they occur. So if I were to show them to you on a map, the largest ones are blue circles here, and the diamonds, red diamonds, are the most damaging events. If I put this on top of a map of population density, you'll see that the most damaging ones inevitably occur in a place where there are a lot of people living. And the largest ones oftentimes occur in subduction zones, really big subduction zones like Alaska, where we have very low to no population density. And so this brings us to the difference between hazard and risk. And if we put this in definition form, seismic risk is the exposure to harm, danger, or loss because of some natural event or disaster. Hazard, when it comes to seismic hazard, is what is the expected frequency of shaking. So not what do we expect for a magnitude earthquake, but it's actually what do we expect for the ground shaking because of all of those 3 types of earthquakes that I told you about. Exposure comes into play when we're thinking about risk. So risk is a combination of the hazard, yes, the hazard matters, but also the exposure. So that's the number of people or assets in an area. And then the vulnerability. So this is the percentage of losses that we can expect from shaking. And so what it comes down to is this is how many people are living in the area, and this one comes down to our buildings and infrastructure. And when we talk about hazard, we will oftentimes make or show maps like this one from the USGS that shows the 2% probability of feeling some shaking. But basically what this is showing is the shaking that you would feel in the 1 in 2,500 year event. So the red colors are very, very strong shaking. The orange is still very strong, but a little less strong, and all the way down to the blue and the gray. And so this is what the Earth is doing. So where are the faults? So for example, you can see the San Andreas fault is this red area because it breaks right to the surface. And you can see that the subduction zone is in here as well, and it's orange because this one makes earthquakes only once every 500 years as opposed to once every 100 years on the San Andreas fault. So that will change the probability and the likelihood that you'll feel shaking. So this matters for risk, but again, as I was mentioning to you, it's also a function of exposure and vulnerability. And so I'm going to show you a video that's taken in Japan in the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. So this was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake, which is as big as we think earthquakes can be in Cascadia on the megathrust. And what's really interesting, or what's remarkable about this, is the lack of damage, really. So this earthquake created 1 to 2 G of shaking in some places, maybe even stronger, which is really, really significant shaking. So, you know, the red on the color scale of those maps. And when you look down, this shaking also lasted for minutes. When you look, you can see that there really isn't that much damage occurring. And when you look at this high rise, it's moving. And I would probably be scared if I were in it, but the high rise doesn't collapse, and it doesn't really sustain any damage either. So this is going to pan to the side, and you'll see another high rise that's also moving. But when this happens, after the event, the buildings are still standing. And this was a really devastating earthquake. But most of that was the tsunami. So most of the buildings here withstood the shaking that was experienced during the earthquake. And it's partly because this region experiences earthquakes, they had good policy, and they also have the resources to build structures that can withstand that kind of shaking. And you can, you know, this is a magnitude 9. If you compare it to an earthquake that was 900 times less energy in Haiti, things are very different, and it's a function of, you know, the vulnerability, and same thing with many other recent earthquakes. And so when we talk about this, what is the answer to reduce risk? Because really what we care about here, talking about going forward, is how do we reduce the risk from these and mitigate them. Hazard is what the Earth is doing, and the Earth is going to do what it's going to do. We can't change that, and it's not really going to change on our human timescale. So we can get better at understanding it, but it's not going to change. Exposure is only going to increase globally. And so what do we do? And the answer is we need to reduce the vulnerability or become a more resilient society. And what does that mean? And there are a lot of things that go into that. And two main things, really. So in order to do this, we first need to fully understand the hazard. So we really need to know how much shaking can you expect. So maps kind of like what Guy and Diego are showing with what the seismic hazard is in a region, ones like this that I showed you from the US Geological Survey. And there's a lot of active research that still goes into these because there are a lot of things we're trying to understand. In particular, in the Northwest in Cascadia, we didn't actually know that it was a subduction zone until the 1980s. And so a lot of our building and policy code is a little further behind than it is in some places like in California. So this is something that we're still working on understanding and updating. So this falls within the realm of seismology, which is what I do. The other part of this is designing for the hazard. So this is the vulnerability or the resilience part. And this relies on this information from seismology, but then it needs to take it a step further and say, how will buildings respond during an earthquake? And how do we make those more resilient? So that is within the engineering realm. And so then the next thing I'll talk about is what can we do about this risk? Here in the Northwest, I mentioned to you that there are these 3 kinds of earthquakes. The crustal ones can be very concerning because they are right under our feet. But oftentimes the thing that most people zone in on is the megathrust earthquake, so the magnitude 8.5 to 9. And that's because they're just so large. And not only are they so large, but they affect a very large geographic region when they happen. This is a figure from some research from Diego, myself, and another of our colleagues, Amanda Thomas, recently, that's showing the average shaking from a lot of sort of synthetic magnitude 8.5 to 9 earthquakes here. So if we were to, using what we know about science, imagine what the shaking is, or compute the shaking from those, and then sort of take the average, what would that be? So that's what's shown here. This color scale is not exactly the same as what you saw in the other images, this intensity scale, but it's very close. So over here, MMI 6, or the intensity 6, is orange instead of yellow, and 8 is sort of this mid red color. So the very dark reds are actually mostly in the offshore and sort of a little bit in these very coastal areas of the 10. So what you can see then is also on the right, these are some cities in the area that we picked out. So what is the intensity that was felt at those places? So if you focus on the green one, that's the same thing that's made in this map. So you can see, for example, in Eugene, where we're sitting, we would expect somewhere around an MMI 6 to 7, potentially higher for that earthquake. And you can see that other places have stronger shaking, like Seattle, Victoria, etc. If we compare this to the first earthquake that happened in February in Turkey, the magnitude 7.8, this is an order of magnitude smaller, but it did break the surface. So this one's breaking the surface, which creates a whole host of challenges in and of itself. This one does not break the surface, and it's instead tens of kilometers beneath our feet. But if we look at the shaking from them, you can see that there are these orange-red regions in this earthquake that Diego was telling you about, and we see a lot of those here, but the geographic extent is very different. So if we plot a line, this white line is about 400 kilometers, and it's the same length as this orange line in this figure here. So if this line I drew is in the area that's experiencing MMI 7 to 10, right directly on the fault. And so if you look at that same area here, you can see that there's a longer length of the region that could potentially feel that during an earthquake. And so one of the things we need to think about when we're preparing is not just the buildings themselves, but also response. So how do you plan for an emergency response in a place where you have really widespread shaking and potentially damage? And this is a scary quote from this article, the really big one in 2015. So keep in mind this is 8 years ago, but I'll summarize it here on the left. There have been a lot of improvements since then. At this time, it was estimated that 75% of structures in Oregon are not designed to withstand a major Cascadia earthquake. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they'll collapse, but it does potentially mean that they will be uninhabitable after. And FEMA had calculated that these numbers of buildings or infrastructure that could be collapsed or compromised. So 1 million buildings, over 3,000 of those schools, about 50% of highway bridges, and that included 15 out of the 17 that span Portland's rivers, which means that you cut off major transportation lines. About 66% of railways and airports, a third of fire stations, a half of police stations, and 2/3 of hospitals. And so there have been a lot of improvements since then, and I'll talk to you about some things that are going on. And there is currently a Dogami study to investigate, how this has changed in just the central Oregon area. So these numbers hopefully look a little bit better than they did 8 years ago, but we still have some work to do. And so what are some key examples of things that we're concerned about here that we need to think about in terms of mitigating risk? Diego mentioned soft stories, that is one, but I'm going to focus mainly on sort of two big ones when it comes to buildings. When it comes to buildings, the first really big one is unreinforced masonry. So these are brick buildings that are unreinforced, meaning they don't have a particular kind of rebar that's holding the brick together. And the reason these are concerning is shaking creates what we call shear. So it moves the building side to side. And brick buildings can't withstand shear. So when they feel shear, the bricks fall out into the side, which can create collapse. You can reinforce these, which makes them much stronger and allows them to withstand shaking. I'm going to show a video. This is an experiment. So this is something that engineers ran to try and understand how their methods of reinforcing these buildings are working. So sometimes what they will do is they will build a shake table that's as big as this room or larger, and they can move that table in exactly the same way that the ground will move during an earthquake. And then they will build structures on top of it that they want to study and understand, and they'll put instruments on them to see how they move, and that will help us understand how the buildings respond. So on the left-hand side is the same design building, like footprint and all that, but it's unreinforced masonry. And on the right-hand side is the same footprint that the building has been retrofitted. And the table is shaking with an example of an actual observed seismic. Sorry, that's really loud. I'm going to turn this down, essentially. So you can actually see what I'm talking about, how the brick doesn't withstand the shear. So you can see that very quickly it can't withstand those side-to-side forces, and the brick will fall off the side. Whereas this one on the right-hand side, if we reinforce it, will stay standing and actually have little to no damage. So you can see there's almost no damage on the right-hand side. So this is something that we can do. So we can retrofit these so that we see minimal damage to them. And in California, the 1933 Long Beach earthquake was the earthquake that made these buildings illegal. So there was a lot of damage because of these buildings in 1933 in Southern California. So since then, those have been illegal to construct. And retrofits have been mandatory since 1986. But we are a little bit behind here because we didn't know about the hazard until really just a few decades ago. And so there's currently no legislation on these. So this is something to work on. In Seattle alone, there are over 1,000 of these buildings. About 15% of them have been retrofit. In Portland, there's no mandatory retrofit policy. And recently, there's a very controversial happening about removing a requirement to notify tenants to put warning signs on buildings like these. And this is a really complicated matter because it's also a social justice and equity issue in the sense that a lot of times these buildings will be in locations of low-income communities as well as marginalized communities. The other type of building that we are sometimes concerned about are really tall buildings, so high-rises, like I showed you the video from Japan. In 1994, during the Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles, we discovered that only light to moderate shaking can sometimes fracture the welds in these high-rises. And there's some recent work, engineering work, that shows that these types of structures are 5 times more likely to collapse than a modern building in a powerful earthquake. And some recent work from an NSF-funded project, and mine project, showed that what we can expect in Cascadia is that in Seattle, the shaking could be 5 times stronger inside the Seattle basin than outside of it. And you can see the background picture here is downtown Seattle, which is in the basin. So you can see there are about 116 buildings that are at least 240 feet tall. And there are design changes in the pipeline as a result of this project. So there's work going on here, and there's a little bit more to do in other locations. And then we oftentimes don't think about this, but buildings are one part of the picture. And the other part is our lifelines. So this is transportation, this is water, this is energy, emergency response. In the Northridge earthquake in 1994, there were a lot of collapsed bridges. So this is kind of a live and learn thing. We learn about the engineering methods when they're shaking that maybe wasn't expected or designed for. And in the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, there were some damaged pipelines for water and sewage. And this is a problem because this means that there's limited potable water after the event. And so this can really limit recovery. And in Oregon, in 2009, there was a study done by the Oregon Department of Transportation looking at vulnerability. So they looked at scenario earthquakes and what would they expect for our bridges here. In 2009, they found that there's really high vulnerability for the bridges in the state. So this is showing you in a magnitude 9 earthquake how many bridges would have slight damage, moderate damage, extensive, or collapse. And you can see that there are a lot of structures in the moderate to collapse category. This is a table that shows the actual numbers based on the road that they're on. And this is a problem not just because the structure collapsing itself is a problem, but because then the lifelines are cut off. So that means that it is a lot more challenging to get response to an area, and a lot of rural communities in the coast and the coast ranges can be cut off from that for a while. So this is a really high priority thing to work on. And thankfully there's been a seismic program at ODOT the last 10 years or so looking at implementing policy changes and retrofitting their structures. So this is something that's being worked on. So this is to retrofit bridges, to replace bridges, and for those that maybe they can't do in the immediate, in the short term, think about how you would detour triage routes if an earthquake happens so you can get the response and the resources that are needed to communities. So I just wanted to lastly wrap up with the sort of individual and collective things that we can do to mitigate the risk. So a lot of what I showed you I think can sometimes leave us feeling a little powerless or helpless because these things are happening up here on the policy level and on the construction level. So there are things individually that you can do as a single person. So there are things like before an earthquake, understand the hazard yourself, understand the structures that are around you yourself, make kits, so water, knowing that potable water can be a concern, think about what your water source is and do you have safe water, food, evacuation plans, life-saving skills. If you have the resources, you can even think about retrofitting your house, like tying it down to the foundation if it needs to be, or taking out a brick chimney. And thinking about building community as well. So there are a lot of community programs or neighborhoods that will create plans for how they would respond to an event after. So that way you know what your network is before something happens. Something I feel that is important to put here is if you feel shaking when you do, you drop, cover, and hold on. So you get to the ground because shaking can sometimes make you fall. You take cover under something that will protect your head and your neck. So for example, so these light fixtures wouldn't hurt your head or neck. And then you hold on because the thing that you're covering under is also going to be moving. So holding on to it also matters. And then there's collectively. So not just on the individual level, but how can we collectively as communities and societies plan for these things and mitigate risk? And to sort of end on a more positive note, there's this Oregon Resilience Plan that was announced for the first time in 2013. And in 2018, there was a policy agenda issued that was called Resiliency 2025, Improving Our Readiness for the Cascadia Earthquake and Tsunami. And this focused on a lot of the things that I'm telling you about today. So it focused on 6 key strategies to mitigate the risk. So this was upgrading schools and emergency service buildings. It was planning for energy infrastructure, implementing earthquake early warning systems. So once strong shaking or the earthquake happens, you can get a warning before the really strong shaking reaches you. And there are a lot of people here at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network that's actually having an all-hands meeting today that work on that with the USGS. And then also strengthening local emergency management and thinking about putting plans into place. So I'll leave that there. The main points are that we can get earthquakes here, really large ones, and shaking similar to what we're seeing in the recent earthquakes in February in Turkey. We've learned a lot about what the earthquakes here in the Northwest can do for shaking, as well as the risk, and we still have a little ways to go on that. But we do know now that we have strong shaking here, and obviously now is the time to prepare. So before the earthquake happens is the time to do it. And so I think the biggest thing in terms of mitigating risk is rethinking the building codes and then also thinking about the individual and collective preparedness. Thank you.
Professor Emerita of Romance Languages. I think we still have the Department of Romance Languages here at the University of Oregon. And I am now Chazan Cantor in the Jewish community. So I'm very honored to be asked to come today, and I'm struck that we are in such a holy time of year. We are a few steps from Easter. We are in the midst of Ramadan, and today is Passover. And as you know, Passover is a celebration of freedom. And we might ask, what is freedom? What is freedom for you right here, right now? Viktor Frankl wrote that freedom was the pause between thinking and acting. And it doesn't take a big brain to figure out that during times of horrendous crisis, when there is destruction and turmoil and chaos, that there is no time for pausing. And we can extend our hearts in our own kind of pause to all of those who are still dealing, who will continue to deal for generations to come. In our tradition, it is fairly typical to hold on to irreconcilable differences all the time. On one hand, we celebrate these Passover dinners in our home, and we sing about freedom, and we remember that freedom has been restored in the past, that freedom can be restored, that we can have time to pause, to hope, to dream, to think. But we also always hold in the other hand the fact that we are still waiting. That not everybody gets to dream, that not everybody is free, that many, many people have no time to pause. And how do we hold those two things together? in a way, this is our tradition. This is what we've been doing for thousands of years. As you probably know, in Turkey, there was a long-lived Jewish community, very rich traditions, magnificent music, a community that is ancient and that still exists today. And we also know that in Turkey that all different kinds of faith traditions came together to help one another in the time of this crisis. So today I'd like to present to you a version of Psalm 126, Shir HaMalot. This is traditionally sung on our festival days. We have 3 festivals, and so it's traditional to sing it today. And in Shir HaMalot, it's called a song of ascension. Of course, it remembers the old days when we would ascend to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But whereas the first 3 lines of the song say, "Restore our fortunes as you have restored them in the past," the second half of the song says, "But we're still waiting. We're still waiting for that restoration. We're still hoping that the time of dreaming, that the time of possibility will come." This song is a call and repeat song. I note that I have Rabbi Jonathan in the audience. I didn't plan him. However, I'm going to sing a line, and I want you to sing it back to me. And if you can't get the words, because it can be tricky, the lies are a super holy way to respond. And I think you know that if you open your mouths in song, it will shake you from the inside out in a way that will make walking out of this door a lot more pleasant and a lot easier as we go forward. Okay, so Shir HaMalot. Shir HaMalot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kechomi. Oh, you clap too. Let's try the clapping again. Shir HaMalot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kechomi. Leskot binu ulshonenu
Was that amazing? Thinking of this event in Brenda, in 1964, Marshall McLuhan came up with the idea of global village. Since then, that was too early after the World War, and global village still seems like a dream. But if we think of, and he also was one of the people who said that just as print media has given rise to the nation states, a thesis that later was developed by others, the rise of electronic medium and television will give rise to this expansion of communication networks that will all be embraced by this global communication networks, for good or bad. But one thing is clear, that no community can be remote now, no war can be local, and no disaster is local. So in this sense, the horizon of our moral community is much bigger and unavoidable. And people talk about deglobalization, this trade war going between China and Russia, but something is irreversible because communication, the clock cannot be turned back on global communication. So these networks are expansive. So when we think of people in Turkey, the earthquakes, the same earthquakes we're talking about in the Northwest. So in this embrace, this unavoidable moral community, we have to be part of now. And how do we become part of that? And that's where the events like this are so important. So I really welcome you all, and thank you all for joining us in this expansion of our moral community. And thank you, Harinder, and everyone involved. I really enjoyed all the lectures, music, amazing. I was at Pace Entrepreneur yesterday here in this very room. So this is something to celebrate, even amid disasters and wars. So thank you very much.
Thank you all again for coming, and we are so honored to have our two UO students who will close this gathering for us. And this is a very special moment for both me and Fundagül because they took a very beloved song written by a Turkish folk poet, and they adapted it for violin and cello. So I thank both Sophie and Alfonso for being here and closing the event with their beautiful tunes. So thank you. Sophie is also Turkish.
Thank you.